tuition fee, an academic fee, or any other fees for academic materials. No other similar provisions.
Right.
And then 10 is the last.
Just again, a reflection, the fact that, there's tuition and their fees, very common to have fees in a variety of school settings, except public school settings. It's just, fees are just like another way of kind of like categorizing costs in attending schools. And I don't know, I just find this kind of an odd call out. The impact will simply be that independent schools, they say, okay, it's not a fee, it just gets lumped into tuition. Still it's just a cost of education.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, you see that at college universities. So
Exactly.
Does this prohibit, so I'm just thinking academic fees. So again, if athletic wear, all that stuff.
That would not be
it would
prohibited.
have to be.
Correct.
Okay. What about a field trip? It's academic.
An academic fee. I mean, I don't know that I have a good answer for that. An
Okay.
academic fee, I think what was contemplated here is like lab fees,
Yeah.
books, etc.
Yeah.
Academic, and that would fit under academic materials also. I think a good way to get at whether that phrase meets your goals is to consult the public schools on whether they charge fees for field trips, etc.
Sure, Aries. Okay. Thank you.
10, the school, so 10 is the last, we're on page 3 at the very bottom. Subdivision 10 is the attestation piece. This is the last change to section 166 in Title 16. So this is the end of that subdivision 9 that we've been talking about. So 10 requires the approved independent school to attest on or before August 1st of each year to compliance with the requirements of subdivision 9, which is everything we just walked through, starting with the Act 173 language. All other statutory requirements for approved independent schools and the board's rules for approved independent schools on a form created by the agency, including documentation of the following. And before we get into the following, I will just note that there's no attestation requirement in Title 16. The 2200 series does require the application to comply with all statutory requirements. And then getting into the following piece, there are state board rules that are kind of analogous. So the attestation has to include an attestation that they're following all of the rules and laws, including a statement of non-discrimination posted on the school's website and included in the school's application materials that is consistent with the Vermont Public Accommodation Act and the Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act. And that is on page 6 of the 2200 series. Rule 2226.6.
Okay.
And that's almost verbatim.
Okay,
from
so
the
that's
state board
already
rules.
in.
And that is currently in effect right now.
Okay.
The difference here is that 483 is requiring an annual attestation, and the state board rules are requiring this in the application materials. An assurance, so the second piece is an assurance signed by the head of school that the school complies with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act and all aspects of the school's admissions and operations. And again, that's taken verbatim from the state board rules. On page 6 there. And then an assurance signed by the head of school that no public funds were used to subsidize the tuition of private payer students. There is no similar provision anywhere else.
So it seems redundant to page 3, little b, I. And it's, you're requiring it, then you're requiring somebody to sign it.
Also to say tough, I mean, I'm guessing you've got all the funds mixed up, isn't it? No public funds for subsidized tuition. Okay. Any questions on section 7 before we move on? And I'm just looking through, so a lot of this is definitely in 2200 series, Act 173, some in Title 16. Ms. Robinson, the parts that aren't in those sections, what's the non-anti-discrimination stuff, what's the best way to describe how the rest of this will help kids to, make education better in Vermont?
So first of all, I would like to point out Representative Buss is in the room, a member of her House counterparts, so she may have thoughts as well. Ultimately, what we're talking about here are public taxpayer dollars, right? In the education fund, taxpayers go every town meeting day and vote on an education dollars. So I think as a general construct, this is putting some minimal, basic guardrails and standards around public taxpayer dollars going to institutions that are providing education to students that are having their education paid through those public taxpayer dollars.
So how would you answer my question? How does it improve education for kids in Vermont?
I don't. Representative Buss might have something. I don't think the purpose of this bill was
To improve education.
it was to address a question around taxpayer dollars going to private schools in Vermont in a changing legal context in which we find ourselves.
Say James, section 8.
Section 8 is an amendment to, again, we're gonna focus on the left-hand column for a second, just to orient ourselves. Section 8 is an amendment to section 828 in Title 16, which is part of the town tuition program statutes, and the title of it is Tuition to Approved Schools. Basically, this statute lists all the different types of schools that public money can go to. So a district shall not pay tuition of a student except to, and then it lists schools. You'll notice when we talk about independent schools and that recognized independent schools are not eligible for public tuition, this is where we're getting that. Recognized independent schools are not listed here, right? Only approved independent schools. So the big amendment here is you'll see the underlined language is new language. So you'll notice everything we just walked through is brand new. It's all underlined. The language in section 8, there's a couple additions at the very top there where we're modifying approved independent school. So now it's not just that tuition can go to any approved independent school, it's just those eligible to receive public tuition located in Vermont. Or, this is the big piece, an independent school, I'm at the very bottom, an independent school in another state, you'll see or country is crossed out, located within 25 miles, we're on page 5 now, of the Vermont border, and approved under the laws of that state or country. So again, if we look at the Title 16 column, the second column, currently this section allows tuition to go to schools outside the country or state that are approved under the laws of that state or country with no geographic limitations, just anywhere in the world. This amendment can't go out of country, and you can only go to an independent, you can only send tuition to an independent school in another state located within 25, the school is located within 25 miles of the Vermont border. So it's a big change.
And we did it, what we did last year for what it's worth in 219, we said, I think, no independent school out of the country, no independent school unless, or public school, unless you border the state of Vermont, I think is what we did.
Yes, I think 219.
Oh, except we did do an exception for a therapeutic school. If that is the best fit for your child, given some of the kids' needs could best be met by a therapeutic school in another state, we said, okay, we didn't want to prohibit that from happening.
Yes. And this takes care of that by adding therapeutic school
Right.
to one of those, to an allowable school to tuition to, with no geographic limitations on it. So H483 proposes to add some requirements, just like we walked through for in-state schools, add some requirements to out-of-state schools, which do not exist in current law. So subsection B, an independent school, I'm on page 5, an independent school in another state located within 25 miles of the Vermont border that is approved under the laws of that state is eligible to receive public tuition if the following conditions are met. So the first is the independent school has adopted and implemented policies and procedures to comply with all anti-discrimination laws applicable to public schools in the state where the independent school is located, and makes reasonable efforts to enforce those policies and procedures, even if those laws by their terms do not apply to the independent school. The school shall attest to compliance with the subdivision on or before August 1st of each year. So we should go back and look at the 2200 series before we keep going. So if you flip back to page 4, on page 6 of the 2200 series,
Page 4 of.
the side by side.
Yep, okay.
And then if you go to page 6 of the 2200 series.
Yep.
Rule 2225.2 says, and actually, if you look at it in context, if you turn to page 5, you'll see tuition, rule 2225.1 is tuition for independent schools in Vermont. And then shall not be paid from public funds unless they follow all these requirements, right? And then if you look at 2225.2, tuition for out-of-state schools. Tuition to be paid for an independent school in another state shall be made in accordance with, and then it refers to the statute that we're talking about here. So that's it. That's the only requirement right now for out-of-state schools, is that reference in the state board rules. I think your next slide is here, do you want me to keep going?
Would you mind? So let's see, where would we be picking up? So we did that section.
B2. I'm
Sorry.
almost done. but
Yeah,
is
why
that-
don't you go?
Okay.
Keep going.
So subdivision 2, the independent school
Yep.
posts and maintains on its website in a prominent place its policy to comply with all anti-discrimination laws, and then the school has to attest to that.
Okay.
And then we're making the independent school that's out of state comply with everything we just walked through in subdivision 9, except for the anti-discrimination section, because you're asking the independent school out of state to follow their own state anti-discrimination laws. So we're not going to ask them to follow Vermont's anti-discrimination laws.
Please, yeah, jump.
How can we make another school out of state follow the tuition piece that is on page 4, section 3 or subsection 3, where no public funds can be used to subsidize the tuition of a private payer? We can't enforce that, right?
They won't be eligible to accept public. Vermont's not going to send public
Right.
tuition to them if
Unless
they
they
don't
do.
agree to do that.
Okay.
That's what this says.
There seems like there's a lot of, frankly, in the paper, a lot more about public schools right now and dealing with anti-discrimination issues and violations and things like that. Do we have any attestations that we require of public schools on this stuff?
I am going to say, I don't know the answer to that specifically.
Okay,
I have, in sitting through all of the testimony that has education, but
yeah,
there's references to lots of forms and attestations that public schools have certifications that they have to fill out.
Okay.
I can't cite.
and maybe
you
I'm
to-
wrong, it just seems like we have Digger
I-
here, but we won't pull
Yep.
it in. But it seems
I-
like there's this school after this school after
So
this
I-
school, yeah.
I can't cite you to a specific state statute or
Okay.
state board rule that says you gotta send this certification related to this.
Yeah.
However, the Public Accommodations Act most certainly applies to public schools.
Yeah.
And the Human Rights Commission has jurisdiction over that.
Yeah.
And there's also federal laws that also have their own anti-discrimination pieces. And if a school accepts federal funds, they have to follow those laws.
Yeah.
Public schools certainly accept federal funds. And so there may be pieces to, annual compliance in relation to the federal pieces as well.
Yep.
So I would encourage you to hear from the field on the specific, what does the form look like? How often is it, et cetera. Again, I think the other piece here is the public schools are public and that they are controlled by school district, which is publicly, the school board is publicly elected, right? So there's a certain amount of public accountability in that area.
I
but
get,
there
totally
isn't.
get it. I wonder if we should just finish this and then we can always come back,
Sure.
just because he's out there. Thanks.
So the last one is the independent school provides an assurance on or before August 1st of each year, signed by the head of school that no public funds were used to subsidize tuition of private payer students.
This, again, I know this is a lot of work, very helpful.
Mhm.
And I think hopefully probably by next Tuesday, this is maybe the last thing we'll be working, the only thing we'll have left is 483. So this is a lot of good points.
Is there anything you need from me? I know that may change between now and tomorrow, but anything that you need from me for tomorrow or anything?
No, but I'm gonna
Okay.
work on this tonight and send witness ideas out and maybe connect with you just to
Sure.
see what we can do.
I don't think you have me scheduled for any testimony tomorrow, but I plan to watch everything that you have going on. Great, thank you. Gotta switch the witness chair. This one's very low to the ground.
Oh.
Very awkward to get up in front of everyone.
The nuclear power program.
Yeah.
Admiral Rickover, we interviewed his commanding officers. We put him in a chair with one leg slightly shorter than the others, put him off balance, so that kind of like to create that. Anyway, I was wondering if you were doing this on purpose.
You must have been really insecure to put
Totally.
someone in that position.
No, he wanted to stress, wanted to see him
We
under
want to
stress.
stress the person.
Wanted to
That's
put him on,
interesting.
it's all very touchy.
That's interesting.
Deal with the interview
Somehow
plus.
the pressure
Very
of nuclear.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Just getting it up, so come get up.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I'm actually just waiting for him to give him some space to move his gear.
I know, I get it.
Always smile. Is that the better chair?
Yeah, let's go.
That chair is. Here, we'll give him the easy chair.
Nice.
Rickover chair.
Somebody.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hello.
How are you? Good. Good. Really glad you're here.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Hang in
I
there.
don't know.
That sounds good.
Thanks for coming over.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So why don't we go, oh, we are live. We haven't gone. We have the treasurer with us, Mike Echeck, and we have been really spending a lot of time talking about school construction. And how is it that we are going to be able to connect our students in 21st century buildings sooner rather than later? I'm gonna ask work if they could just quiet down a little bit. And it's expensive. You know, we've written to our federal delegation, we recognize this is a big deal. We're not gonna be able to do it by ourselves. But we think you also may have some ideas around how schools can bond, have these conversations, and maybe get us to a point where buildings can get better. So with that,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the committee. Happy to be here today and happy to talking about this. This was something that we identified early on and even before we got sworn in as a priority. We heard from so many communities around the state that they were struggling with the current status of their infrastructure with the public schools. And some were in better states than others, but quite a number of elementary schools and high schools, across the state were not in anywhere near 21st century learning environment, but potentially dealing with life and health issues, as well as, in some places capacity issues, in some places sort of under capacity issues. So it sort of runs the full gamut, right? So the concept of the task force that I know the committee is discussing and has been passed out of the House is, I think, really attractive because they're, as you know, I think it's Act 75 has a couple of key analyses that are heading our way, just generally at the state heading our way. One is that assessment of sort of that price tag, right? Like what would it cost to get all of our schools to, both in terms of life and safety, but also in terms of, more advanced 21st century learning facilities. What would that cost? But the other thing that Act 75 is doing is looking at the ways that other states similar to Vermont are financing school construction. So whether that's New England or whether it's potentially smaller rural states from across the country. Secretary French had mentioned to me before he left, we had an opportunity to visit, that he was hoping that study would be done sometime this summer, so in advance of the assessment. So I think that is something that would give us some opportunity to generate some ideas, or at least to see structurally how other states are participating in direct school aid. I know all the other New England states are now having a program for direct school aid. I was told by somebody that is the relative authority on this topic that we were the only state not to have such a program. It's not just in New England, but the only state in the country. So I think that financing report will come back with a lot of good information that, if the task force is created, which I hope it will, can sink its teeth into. On the bonding side, that is something that we'll want to take a look at in terms of what Rhode Island and Massachusetts have done. They basically went out and did relatively extraordinary bonding. I think in Rhode Island, it was the largest bond they'd ever issued, 250 million, and then another 250 million. So $500 million in total. And they used that to be a portion of what a local school district would also then have to come up with to complete a project. So maybe it was 20 or 30 or 40% in some instances that they would use that bonding to help leverage the local bonding capacity as well. So that provides an interesting model, but our bonding capacity is obviously, we've been trending down in terms of the amount of outstanding debt that we've been issuing every year. That's been a strategic decision because other states are similarly trending down, particularly the AAA peer-rated states. So if that were an option, it would certainly have to be done very deliberately and carefully, and we'd have to know that it's going to make a substantial impact in terms of what we can leverage in trying to solve that price tag that this report will come up with. And then the only other thing I want to mention that I think is an opportunity for at least a portion of school construction is the Inflation Reduction Act and the direct tax payment provisions that are in that bill. So previously, those direct tax provisions were only benefited an entity that had a tax liability. So if you're a not-for-profit or municipality, you couldn't offset your tax liability because you wouldn't have had any taxes to owe. But the IRA changed those provisions so that you can get a fully redeemable tax credit for, things like, maybe a new heat pump, or the way that you heat your school, the way that you electrify your school. Maybe it's through solar panels either on the school or next to the school, or an array that's near the school. And those arrangements have happened now, like in the Winooski School, but they sort of are a complicated, arrangement where a third-party developer benefits from the tax credit and then provides some of that to the school. Now it would be much more streamlined. I think for new construction or for renovation, I'll leave this here just as a summary of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act for education. But it could cover 30-40% of some of these really important and expensive heating and electric components for schools. So that's sort of another source. But I think all of these things are what ultimately the task force will have to look at and come back with recommendations. I know at the federal level, wish there were more at the federal level in terms of direct aid. And I know there have been conversations in the past, but those don't seem to have ever been funded.
And one of the things that I keep thinking about is how many years will it take us to actually accomplish all the work that
Yeah.
we need to accomplish? I know some of that we'll find out, but it's not as though, in my opinion, in the next 5 years, we're gonna look back, this is gonna be a long process.
Yeah, I think that's right, Mr. Chair. And, you know, the other thing about it is, you know, there's other factors at play too, but, you know, had the opportunity to have a tour of the new New City School and heard about their construction process. And I think they had 3 different bids, if I remember correctly. 2 of them were before COVID, and I think the third one was during COVID. But their overall project, you know, renovation of 100,000 square feet, 150,000 square feet, and then addition of 75,000 square feet costs like 65 million. So it looks like a brand new school all the way through. It looks phenomenal. It's a great place to go to school and imagine for all those students. But now Burlington is talking about, you know, close to $200 million just a few years removed when the DC, you know, started its process. So it's not going to get less expensive either. I guess is my point as we continue to go along. So, you know, on one hand, that can be daunting. On the other hand, I think it suggests that you know, tackling the issue now is better than 5 or 10 years from now.
Just a curiosity question. You mentioned that Vermont is trending down on its intended bonding levels. So what's the strategic decision there to do that? What drives that?
Yeah, so we look at ourselves relative, like I said, to some other states. Like, so we don't want to be, we want to be sort of in the median or below the median in terms of overall debt outstanding. And many of the other states have been lowering their outstanding debt because they've been transitioning to something called PAYGO, where they pay with cash instead of bonding. So it's not that they are doing less capital improvements or less capital construction, but in the past, maybe it was almost completely done through bonding. And now a greater and greater portion of it is being done through cash and cash funds or PAYGO. So last year, PAYGO cash fund was created in Vermont. There is, I don't know where the discussion is this legislative session about funding it in terms of the permanent revenue stream so that it can become more and more of a part of our capital construction. But that's for a lot of the reasons why other states have been trending down. So if we don't also trend down, then we're going to start to stand out as having much more outstanding debt relative to those peer states. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think there's just been a general viewpoint that we want to try to move to the system that other states have, this PAYGO system, and that would require putting more money into the cash fund and having less outstanding debt over time. So, you know, for example, I think the CDAC, the Capital Debt Advisory Affordability Committee, recommended $108 million in total bonding for this biennium, so 54 million, and that's down. It's down like more than 25%. I think it's like 25 to 35%. Just 2000, sort of the 2015 time period in terms of the overall number. So that recommendation every year has trended down since 2014.
Well, yeah, just so I have several, but let me just, I just want the same topic.
We've got plenty of time.
I
So,
love that.
so we seem to be neither PAYGO nor bond. in current
For school construction, you're saying?
school construction, and many other, I mean, if we're only at $54
Right.
million a year, shoot, I'd spend that in a day in my last project.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, I don't know if you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but we're neither PAYGO nor bonding.
Right.
Do you see a, in the near horizon, an appetite to really go down one path or the other? I mean, we can talk about school construction all day, but unless there's an appetite.
Yeah.
Probably from the executive branch.
So, the environment that we're in now with high interest rates and high inflation, hopefully will not last forever, obviously, but hopefully not last in the not too distant future as well. It would have been much easier to go out with a significant bond that was beyond our normal issuance. I think in a low interest rate environment, you could go out pretty inexpensive money for important projects for long term. It's more expensive now because of where interest rates are. But I do think if we have a comprehensive plan to address this issue around the lack of funding for direct school construction aid, and we do it in a thoughtful way, that is something, that is an investment that can be explained to the folks that care about this kind of thing, which would be the rating agencies or other folks that monitor the space. If it's done without a comprehensive plan, I think it becomes a lot harder to explain to them. So I think that's one of the things this task force, I hope, could do, is not just analyze the assessment, but come up with a comprehensive plan to prioritize significant, potentially significant investments in schools over the next decade, let's call it. Because you're absolutely right. There's so many priorities, there's so many needs that the 54 million, that I just mentioned, that gets taken up quite quickly. So you need something in addition. But on the cash fund piece of it too, I do think it's smart for us to continue to build out that cash fund concept and dedicate more money toward it, and allow us to have a higher percentage of our capital expenses be done through those cash payments rather than through bonding.
Like, because mine is related
That's all
to,
yours.
okay, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. My question is also around the bonding capacity. And I know that in Burlington, when we took on a fair amount of debt, there was a lot of talk about the Moody's ratings, and we were worried our rating was going to go down. And it turns out that that whole rating system is actually kind of, sort of an art. It's like a choreography. It's not always cut and dry. And so we did have to weigh, like, well, yes, we're taking on this debt, but what would we look like as a city if we didn't have a school? And how would that affect our bonding rate?
Yeah,
So
that's right.
I guess that was my question, was our states subject to the same kind of rating system as municipalities, or is it similar?
I think it's similar. There are probably technical differences, but in the broad scheme of things, like, can you repay your debt is ultimately what those rating agencies are concerned about. So that could mean your population, your revenues, tax revenues, whether your population is growing or shrinking, whether those tax revenues are growing or shrinking, the business mix of your state. So, all of those things are important, whether it's a municipality, or whether it's a state.
Okay, great, thank you.
You see that?
No, I just had eye contact with one of my colleagues and given the comment. So, sure. No comment.
Okay.
So,
Please, yes, please.
because this is a rare opportunity.
No, it's a rare
Rare
opportunity.
opportunity to talk to the treasurer. So,
You can come never anytime you want.
well, you alluded to the fact that we want to put ourselves somewhere in the middle of the states as far as, is it middle of New England, rating, bonding averages, or nationwide that we're targeting?
Yeah, so we look at nationwide, but we also look at AAA sort of peer states, so the places the states we're trying to emulate and get to. So the three things that we look at specifically are the percentage of our debt outstanding relative to our per cap, what it means per capita to each honor. We look at it as a percentage of our tax revenue as well. So like, what's our revenue that we're taking in, and what percentage of that is paying our debt. And then there's a third metric as well that I probably have to get back to you on, but it's more on the financial side in terms of the tax revenue. And I know what it is. I think it's just total like GDP or total economic activity per month. So those are sort of the measurements that we look at relative to ourselves in those peer rated states. But then also just in terms of overall debt outstanding, that's just sort of another metric against all states that we look at as well. And I can get you a copy of the most recent, capital debt advisory committee report that comes out every biennium.
Yeah. So who are our peer states? Is that?
A lot of them are New England. We are the highest across all of the rating agencies, the highest rated in New England. But some of our New England counterparts have a AAA rating for some of the rating agencies. Others are, there's states like You know, this is states like Midwest that have really strong credit ratings. You know, I can't, if I name it, I'm gonna name the wrong one, but there's some states that have very limited debt outstanding and they have almost exclusively cash fund pay-go. So they don't even use their bonding capacity, but they're in good economic condition that they have AAA ratings. So it's a whole host of states, but a lot of the Northeast states have pretty good ratings. A lot of the Midwest states have pretty good ratings. States that don't, you know, ones with high pension obligations, like Illinois or, you know, other states similar to that is a real challenge. So your debt that's outstanding, including your pension obligations, and then sort of the vibrancy of your economy are things that you really want to look at. So are you growing or are you shrinking? So for example, Florida has really a lot of significant, at the moment has a lot of significant population growth, and they can support more and more debt because they have more and more tax revenues, which isn't the case in every state.
Please.
One last one,
Yeah.
but when they're looking at bonding ratings, I would assume if you're looking at like, let's say, an educational landscape, the fact that you're going to be, you know, potentially redoing, refurbishing, renovating schools would point to economic growth, population growth, et cetera, right? I would think.
Well,
Good question.
Yeah, so I think, you know, one of, you know, for our rating agency specifically, you know, they pointed for a lot of years to our demographics, that we're getting older and our workforce is getting smaller. And what that would mean, right, long term, is that there's less people paying taxes, and therefore you're gonna have a hard time paying your debt back potentially. So, you know, they have recognized in the more recent updates that there have been some positive signs on our demographics, that our population has increased, their tax revenues have increased, that there seems to be a demand of people moving here. They've recognized investments in housing as a positive thing as well. So I do, you know, a school, just like with Burlington, a school system is important for a state. So that, those kind of, and it's kind of critical for a state. It's kind of one of the sort of the main sort of public infrastructure that someone would expect. So it's almost a necessity relative to our demographics to have, you know, strong school system, which would include safe and productive physical school infrastructure. And we did ask Rhode Island, you know, because they had a massive, you know, unusually large debt outstanding that they took on, and they haven't had a negative indication from their credit rating agencies yet. I'd like to know more about that, but that was what the treasurer's office indicated to us last fall.
Senator Wheeling.
Time for one?
Yeah.
This is like a pie in the sky question. Trying to get my head wrapped around, you know, the state cost for infrastructure. Well, I really like get my hands on that report right there sometime. But if we've got, I think it's 486, where it's a school construction bill. I'm getting a lot of calls from constituents that want me to vote in favor of that bill because they want to stop PCB testing. So I really want to know what the overall state level PCB is by school, because we recently had a meeting with all the superintendents across the road, and they basically all said they need new schools. So I'm trying to think about the overall cost in addition to all the infrastructure issues. We got the bridges and the, you know, wastewater treatment facilities. And I wouldn't want to be sitting in your shoes having to balance all those balls. But what do you think about if everybody came back in and said they needed a new school? How would you do it?
Yeah, I mean, so the assessment that's being done, you know, that's not going to be done till, like, you know, this is the AOE providing the timeline, so I can't tell you if it's going to hold or not, but October of this year, so October 2023, they think that financing study will be done sooner, or they told me in the summer. But that assessment will look at those, you know, whether or not the school needs, whether or not a district would need a new school, whether they need renovations or improvements, based on life and safety, based on, you know, just the limitations that maybe they have relative to the expectation for a school in the 21st century. So that will come with a price tag as well, and a total cost. So I'm very fascinated, interested in what that total cost would be. But I would suspect not every single district, or far from it, needs a new school. Probably almost every district needs some sort of upgrading to some degree. Yeah, well, not even just for PCD, just more broadly, they might need work done, because a lot of our schools were built around the same time and they're dealing with the same challenges in terms of infrastructure. So it's going to be a big number, I have no doubt, right? And we're going to have to figure out how to, and this again, another reason why I think this task force is great. The original task force, I just don't, the PCD code components that were added from the House, is not an expert in that area, but the other part of the task force is the sort of coming back with a way to strategically incentivize or prioritize how to spend what will be a limited school construction aid, even if we engage in another program. So is the school overpopulated? Is it underpopulated? Is it in need of life and safety improvements? Is there an energy efficiency component with the project? Is there other funds that you can pull down as well? Those are some of the things that they did in Rhode Island with open and more. So it is a way of prioritizing, not to say that not every project will get to, but if there are certain projects that you get to in the first 5 years versus the first 10 or 15 years, it'd be good to, have that be part of your overall comprehensive plan.
Is there anything else you need from us on this issue? Just,
No, I mean,
of course, money.
Yeah, right. I do think there's some money. I believe, I understand Ashland's here that there was included in the Senate version, right? Ashland, there's some.
For the record, Ashland Plan with the Treasurer's Office. My understanding is that your Senate Appropriations Committee was warm for the $200,000 appropriation.
Right, we know that they're
But,
very warm to that. Yeah, definitely. We're thinking real money
You're saying after the fact.
after that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Well, I don't want to,
Thank you.
we want to look at the challenge, I mean,
Yep,
I know it's going
I
to be big,
understand.
but we want to know the specifics. And what we would need from you, I really think this task force,
Well, Senator
necessary.
Jewett has really led the
Yeah.
way on this, and which we appreciate. And then, Senator Williams and Weeks were behind her 98% of the time. Senator Sheehan and I were just, let them just do their thing. It's all great, it's all great. And someday, well, can't thank you. I'm so grateful to have this committee. Anything else for our treasurer? Thanks.
Well, if you have any follow-up questions,
Yeah.
please.
Really appreciate
Yeah,
it. Really
for sure.
appreciate making the time to come over.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. let's see. Sure.
Have a good afternoon.
Thanks. Really good to see you. Mr. Odell,
Oh, yeah, sure.
please. Thrilled you're here.
So am I.
Great. And we don't have a lot of time. I
Okay.
understand you have a presentation. I think perhaps Senator Gulick has seen it, maybe at one point. And so maybe others have as well. Please. And we would be willing, we would be particularly happy if you could take us through it relatively quickly.
Okay.
And for about the next 15 minutes or so, take us through, and we'll just see where the committee is on in terms of questions. But we appreciate you coming in.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So just for clarification, I actually did 2 videos.
Okay.
One was on the history of tuitioning in the state of Vermont. The second one was on the financing piece. So this one is focusing on the financing
Okay.
piece. I can share the links to the YouTube videos if you guys wanted to view the other one on the history piece as well too.
I appreciate that you want to go quickly, because we all probably want to.
No, I'm not. I'm kind of reading the more of the.
Oh, all right, because because this does seem actually pretty important, so it's.
I'll do whatever you all need.
this is my 2
You've
cents.
got about 5 minutes, so.
So if I leave you within 3 points today, the 3 points are going to be that Vermont's tuitioning system does place an increased burden on the education fund. Second, that if we make more schools eligible for public funds, that's going to increase obligations on the ed fund. And third, that our tuitioning system in the state actually impacts all taxpayers, not just the ones from the towns that tuition.
If I wanted to see where those 3 points are they in this?
They're at the
I
very
think they're
last
great.
page,
Okay.
but I was going to tease them up.
Yeah,
for you
no,
at the
but that's
beginning,
helpful. I appreciate
So
it.
that I hope that by the time I get to the end.
Yeah.
That hopefully I've made the point. So with that, then I'm just going to jump in with the end fund itself, which I'm sure that all of you guys are familiar with. So for fiscal year 24, the education fund is projected to have just over $2 billion in it. And just to highlight, the ed fund actually receives revenues from multiple sources, as it's shown in the pie chart. It gets 100% of the sales and use tax in Vermont, 1/3 of the purchase and use tax, 1/4 of the meals and rooms tax, all of the lottery revenues. There's a Medicaid transfer and a handful of other smaller revenue sources, but the remainder comes primarily from both the non-homestead and the homestead property taxes. So the way to look at this is that when one or all of those consumption-based taxes runs short, or the demands on the education fund increase, then the balance needs to be made up in the property taxes. Okay, so go to the next slide. So then how do we determine how much money needs to be raised by property taxes? So in order to answer that question, it's important to understand, and this is a key point, that while local school districts determine how much they spend on education, it's actually the state's responsibility to guarantee that the money is there. Put another way, that local school districts and their voters approve local budgets, but it's the state's responsibility for funding the approved budgets. Next slide. So in order to determine how much money needs to be raised by the property tax, the state totals up the amount of all voter approved school budgets and adds to that amount any other obligations on the ed fund. We take that total and then subtract out all of the other revenue sources, the ones that we talked about on the previous slide, and the amount that needs to be raised via property taxes is what remains. So now that we know how much needs to be raised by property taxes, how do we get to the local property tax rate? At its core, property tax rates are based on education spending per pupil. So all other things being equal, if the school district spends more money per pupil budget to budget, then their local tax rate will go up. But as we noted previously, because the state is responsible for funding all of those voter approved budgets, they also have a hand in setting a key number that impacts all school districts in the state, and it's a figure that's called the property yield number. By definition, the property yield number is the amount of per pupil spending that a $1 tax rate will generate. That $1 rate will generate a different amount of revenue each year depending on the state's grand list value and the health of the education fund. In the tax calculation formula, the yield number is divided into a district's per pupil spending to determine the equalized tax rate. The yield number, as you guys probably all know, is set by all of you at the end of the legislative session when all of the ed fund obligations are known and the revenue sources from all other sources are considered. So while the property tax rate in each town is influenced by their local spending, it's also influenced by the voter approved budgets in school districts all across the state. So to briefly recap, because I know this is a lot in a short period of time, right? So local property taxes
Well,
are.
for what's worth, a lot of us have had the Brad James overview.
Okay, good.
So we are coming in somewhat educated.
Good.
Yes.
No,
yes,
that's
yes.
perfect then. So like I said, local education spending per pupil, so voter approved budgets divided by the number of pupils. But that local property tax rate is also influenced by statewide spending in education, which influences the property yield number that local districts apply to determine their local tax rates. All right. So what goes into then those voter approved local budgets? That depends on whether or not you're an operating town or a tuitioning town. So for districts that operate their own public schools, their local budget is their expenditure budget, or the amount that it costs to educate and operate their schools, right? For districts that tuition some or all of their students, the cost for tuitioning those students to other schools is included in the proposed budget. And those tuition costs can vary. The amount of allowed tuition depends on the destination school for a given student and is outlined in Vermont statute. The cost to send a student to another public school in Vermont is the full tuition charged by that public school. In most cases, that is the net cost per pupil. The tuition cost to send a student to a private school equals the average announced tuition as set by the AOE and is determined yearly based on the average cost per pupil at public schools in Vermont. For K through 6, in the current year, that figure is $16,020. And for 7 through 12, it's $17,278. But there are some exceptions to these. Some schools are allowed to charge more for tuition. They're allowed to set their own rate if the school meets or assures that it will substantially comply with ed quality standards. So an example of that is Sharon Academy, current tuition $18,500.
We just heard from Hanover High School, 22,000.
So that's a public school.
Right.
So public schools are allowed to charge the full amount of their tuition, right?
Okay.
We're talking here about what a private school can charge. And it's based on the statewide average unless they meet one of these other criteria.
Got it.
Okay. So the other criteria, if a school is considered a state approved school as the result of designation, Thetford Academy falls into that category, tuition of $20,963. If the school operates a career tech center, examples are Linden at $20,827, and St. Johnsbury $20,855. Or finally, if the electorate votes to approve a different tuition amount. An example of that is Burton at $19,200. And these higher tuition amounts do have an impact on the education fund. So in 2021, the Vermont State Auditor issued a report on tuitioning and reported that these higher tuition rates cost Vermont taxpayers $3.6 million more than it would have had the average announced tuition rate been paid. Most towns do not tuition their students. So how many kids are we talking about? And then how much total tuition money are we talking about? If you go to the graph on the next page, it gives you an overview of where the money is going and how many kids are represented in those figures. So this is based on fiscal year 21 data from the AOE, which was the most recent or the most current that was available to me. The numbers on the left y-axis are the number of students, and on the right we have the cost in millions of dollars. So on the far left, you can see we've got just over 2,400 students are using public money to attend another Vermont public school, accounting for almost 40 million. To the right of that is Vermont private schools, which are receiving just over 2,800 students for just over $45 million. Next to the students going to public schools in another state, that's about 560 students for a cost of almost $11 million. And finally, students going outside of the state to private schools that are both nationally and internationally. And that's just over 100 students at a cost of just under 1.5 million.
Sure, let me just ask quickly. So I'm just confused. This tuition cost with the blue, it looks, I know I'm misreading this. You can just help me. We don't have more students in private schools. So is this just, these public schools these are all tuitioning?
These are just the
Everybody
tuition
here.
kids.
Thank you.
Just the tuition kids, yes, not the kids that are going to their own.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Sure. So what if those tuition costs go up? So one recent example, and then also a hypothetical analysis, could provide some indication of what could happen if tuition costs increase as a result of more private schools becoming eligible for taxpayer funds. So back in April of last year, Vermont Digger reported that the Agency of Education has approved Sharon Academy as an independent school meeting education quality standards, or EQS. So as a result, as we noted previously, this allows Sharon to set their own tuition rate. The increase is almost $1,700 per student, and that had some school districts that tuition into Sharon concerned. Both the superintendent and the board chair for the White River Valley Supervisory Union reported to the state that the change in tuition rate would have a negative impact on the supervisory union, potentially driving up per pupil costs and increasing the tax rate. That's what I want to focus on next. Let's see how that can happen. So let's say a tuitioning town sends 100 students to a nearby Vermont public school. The receiving school's per pupil costs are $15,000 per student. So the sending town spends 1.5 million and the receiving school gets 1.5 million in revenue. The receiving school, let's say, had 150 of their own local students. So with the 100 tuition students, the total student body is now 250 kids. The total budget for the school is 3.75 million, which equates to a per pupil spending figure of $15,000. So let's move on from there. Now let's say that the tuitioning town sends 25 of those 100 students to a nearby private school. The private school, let's say, charges the exact same tuition as the public school, $15,000 per student. The public school now receives 25 fewer students, and with that, a loss of $375,000. And they now have a decision to make. They could cut the budget to make up for the loss of the revenue. This may require cuts to staffing or programming, or they could maintain the same budget, increasing per pupil costs and increasing the tax rate. For this hypothetical, let's say that that school board decides they're going to maintain the budget. So with the same budgeted amount of $3,750,000, but only 225 students, we end up with per pupil spending of $16,667. This increase in per pupil spending has actually two impacts. And the first is fairly obvious to most school board members. Higher per pupil spending means a higher local tax rate. The second one, though, may be a little less obvious. So remember earlier when we talked about the differing tuition amounts, and in particular, the average announced tuition that a private school can charge. This increase in per pupil spending factors into that statewide average, pushing the average up, allowing then those private schools to charge more. And it's not just the cost of tuition that can push up the average per pupil cost. Every time a line item increases in a local school district budget, an increased burden falls on the education fund. Multiply that by school districts all across the state, and it can have a noticeable impact on per pupil spending. And some of the increases are not the result of any local school board decisions. Some come in the form of state and federal mandates, many of which only apply to public schools. Some of those examples are universal meals, school employee health benefits, ed quality standards, PCD testing and remediation. All of those items can push up per pupil spending, resulting in an increase in the tuition rate that private schools are allowed to charge. For districts that tuition students, then, what options do they have available to them if the voters turn down a budget or pressure the school board to decrease costs or tax rates? So for those districts that tuition some of their students, there are limited options. Their primary recourse comes in reducing costs in the public schools that they do operate. And when 60 to 80% of a school budget comes from costs associated with salaries and benefits, the result can frequently be a reduction in the number of teachers or staff. For those districts that tuition all of their students, the options are even more limited. Here's an example. In 2018, the town of Win Hall, Vermont, which tuitioned all of its students, was facing an extraordinary tax increase. And it was the result of 19 more kids moving into the school district than they had anticipated. In an attempt to stem the tax rate increase, the voters at town meeting discussed lowering the tuition that was paid to Burr and Burton from the higher amount that they had previously voted to authorize. During that discussion, Seth Bongartz, who at the time was president of Burr and Burton's Board of Trustees, offered Win Hall both a reprieve, but it also came with a warning. He offered that what they were going to do that year was accept the state average tuition for Win Hall students, so effectively lowering their costs for tuition. But he also said in that same statement, it's like we have never done this before and we can never do it again. Residents were relieved. They gave them a standing ovation with that. But at the same time, they also tasked the school board with going back and trying to figure out ways to help stem this tax rate increase over the upcoming years. So as the Win Hall example shows, right, tax rates are important to people. When they climb too high, it can put a community into a challenging position. And we talked about tax rates earlier, but I do want to spend a little bit more time digging just a little bit deeper into how we determine education tax rates in Vermont and the impact of the current tuitioning system on those tax rates. So Vermont education tax rates are based on ed spending per pupil, but more accurately, what we're really talking about here is education spending per equalized pupil. And an equalized pupil is just a way to account for the fact that different types of students cost more or less to educate than others. These weights were the focus of a whole lot of attention during the 2022 legislative session, where we found out that the weights that we had been using for years were outdated and didn't really reflect the true cost of educating those students in public schools. So as a result, you all last year passed a law establishing new student weights that will go into effect in the next year, not the one that we just finished, but the next one. Those new student weights cover categories such as students in poverty, students who are English language learners, students in secondary grade levels, and students in small or rural schools. And many school districts all across the state actually stand to benefit from these new weights as their equalized pupil counts are going to increase, effectively lowering their tax rate for the same amount of education spending, right? And the spending per equalized pupil is not only used to determine the local tax rate, it's also used to set the public schools tuition rate. But if you recall from a prior slide, the tuition rate for private schools is different. It's based either on the state average or a higher amount. It's not tied to student weights. Because weighting is not a direct factor in setting tuition amounts to private schools, the end result is that most students attending private schools are either over or underfunded. And where the private school's tuition is higher than the state average, it's more likely that the student is overfunded. This overfunding of students in private schools is also a result, in part, of private schools' selective enrollment practices. A 2001 court case acknowledged that point. In St. Johnsbury Academy versus DH, the court and all of the parties involved actually acknowledged that the private school, in that case St. Johnsbury, was not required to accept all students from St. Johnsbury. So it's this factor, coupled with the reality that nearly all private schools have selective enrollment policies, results in those students going to private schools more likely being overfunded. And conversely, because of those selective enrollment practices, many of the more disadvantaged students actually remain in the public school system. So if we go to this next slide, we can see that that's the point that has an impact on tuition costs in the state.
Which slide? Sorry, just to be
Yeah.
clear.
So now we're on the one that says tuitioning and student weighting, and it's the bar graph. Oh, we're way past that. Nope, keep going.
No.
Looks like a bar graph, that one right there. Sorry, sir. Yes, yes, perfect. So when private schools selectively enroll students, the result is that students with greater needs and greater costs are disproportionately served by Vermont public schools. And data from the Vermont Agency of Education back in 2017 bears this out. If we look at 3 different categories of schools, so the historic academies, private schools, but excluding those that specialize in serving special ed students, and Vermont public schools, we look at all of the publicly funded or tuition students, we see that 37% of those students go to the historic academies, 14% go to private schools, and 49% to Vermont public schools. If we then look at how many of those publicly funded students are eligible for free and reduced lunch, which is a measure of poverty, we see that 31% are attending the historic academies, 10% are at other private schools, and 59% are in a Vermont public school. Finally, if we look at how many of those publicly funded students are students with disabilities, we see that 27% attend the historic academies, 5% other private schools, and 68% were Seneca Vermont Public School.
Yeah, Senator Gill.
2022, we know what year this came out?
This is 2017 data. I could not get any more current data from the Agency of Education on this.
I think
Moving on then to the next slide. And then a district's tuition configuration can also have an impact on per pupil spending. There are many different tuitioning configurations in Vermont, districts that operate all grades, districts that operate or tuition some grades, and then those that have a combination of both. From AOE data from fiscal year 23, you can see that on average, districts that operate all grades have a lower cost per equalized pupil than districts that tuition all grades. But if you take a look at that graph, what about those other districts that tuition only some of their students? Why are their per pupil costs not as high as those that tuition all of their students? Go to the next slide. In many cases, it's because they're cutting costs at the elementary level to make up for the increased spending at the secondary level where they tuition. So data from AOE in fiscal year 25 averaged an AMPS tuition report bears out that analysis. If we look at a few schools from the area around St. Johnsbury, we see that St. Johnsbury School District, which tuitions the secondary grades, has a greater disparity in spending between elementary and secondary grades as some of the other nearby operating districts.
I know we're,
No, we're good.
okay, can we unpack that a little bit?
Sure.
I just, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm just having, I want to make sure I'm understanding this. So is this insinuating that they're, like, the elementary schools are getting less than they should be getting potentially?
I cannot comment on whether or not they're getting less than they should be getting. I can say that it looks like there's spending disparity between the grade levels in an attempt to try to lessen the tax rate increase or the increase in the overall budget.
Okay, but we know generally the secondary students cost more to educate.
Correct.
Okay. I think I've got my head around it. Okay.
So if we go to the next slide, then I also want to note that there are also financial implications associated with special education funding. So in 2018, the legislature passed Act 173, which was intended to enhance the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services provided to students that need additional support, including students receiving special education services. After being delayed for several years, the law is now in place, and instead of being reimbursed for the cost of special education, public school districts in Vermont now receive a block of money based on the number of students in the district. This has made budgeting challenging for some school districts that tuition students to private schools. As noted by Legislative Counsel Beth St. James in a presentation that she prepared for House Education back in January of this year, the new law allows approved independent schools to bill local public school districts for costs beyond general tuition rates if incurred pursuant to a student's individualized education plan or IEP. Because of this, which is the next slide, some tuitioning school districts are worried that their block grant will be eaten up by the cost of special education services provided by those private schools that they tuition to, leaving them with insufficient funds to be able to pay for the services for the students in their own public schools. In an article that appeared in the Manchester Journal back in December of 2020, the Taconic and Green School Board articulated that concern, stating that they were concerned that special education expenditures for our 9 through 12 students, so those students that they tuition, was going to remain the same, putting excessive budget pressure on their pre-K through 8 system or the portion of the system that they operate. One final note on tuitioning and education finance. So since Act 68, and then adjusted with Act 46 of 2018, Vermont has had a mechanism in place in statute that attempted to control local school district spending by penalizing districts for spending above a certain amount. It was known as the excess spending threshold. The excess spending threshold is calculated annually by the AOE, and the figure is set at 121% of the statewide average education spending per equalized pupil, increased by inflation. For districts that spend more than this amount, they're double taxed on the amount that's over the limit.
Where is that? Is that the education, state education tax that gets assessed to the municipality, to everybody? How do they assess it?
That excess spending threshold is a number that was defined every year by the AOE. So at my local district level, if my per pupil spending was higher than that amount, locally, every dollar that I spent above that amount, I was double taxed on.
Double tax, by which tax?
The education tax, that local town's education tax. Okay. The one thing that I'll note about the excess spending threshold is that it can create challenges for all school districts, but particularly those ones that operate some grades and tuition others. And that was the case back in 2015 when school districts all across the state were struggling to craft budgets that fell below the excess spending threshold. Back then, Digger reported that school boards in Linden met with the heads of both Linden Institute and St. Johnsbury Academy to implore them to keep any tuition increase as low as possible. And in that same article, the chair of the Linden Town School Board noted that for every $800 increase in tuition per high school student would result in a $510 decrease in what could have been spent at the K-8 level. A couple of final notes on the excess spending threshold. There is a carve out in the statute. So districts that tuition all of their students, so all students K through 12, and have not voted to pay a higher amount, they're excluded from the excess spending threshold. The second thing, and it's important to note, that currently this provision of the law is suspended during the implementation of the new weights. So I'm gonna get to the summary page. I'm hoping that I covered the three things that I was gonna tell you. If you all have any questions, there's a final QR code on the last page that takes you to a Google Doc that has all of the supporting data for the items that were in the presentation.
Is this posted on the website?
Sure, everything's set up.
I think it was 2020, Pierce was the treasurer. She said that education funding is going to increase. I think it was 13% the previous year. That was at the select board. I was at the local one. And lo and behold, they found some money someplace and they dropped it to 9%. In fact, going down 3%. So, so the municipalities, when they get assessed their education tax, they don't know what it's, that's not across the board. Each town could have a different rate, what you just said, depending on their spending.
Each town can have a different rate depending on their spending, but what Act 60 and 68 did, so it said for the same amount of education spending per equalized pupil, you'll have the same tax rate. Now, if those two towns actually had the same CLA, then the tax rate would be identical. And if two people in those towns had similar incomes and lived in a similar valued house, their education taxes would be exactly the same. That helps.
Anything else, Mr. Odell?
So simple.
Yeah, should have come in 3 months ago.
Yeah, I will. I mean, I'll just note, like I've been on the school board now for 13 years. I think it
Which
took,
board?
Norwich.
Oh, Okay.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
had Jay,
we
my
just had Jay,
superintendent was in
yeah.
here just earlier this afternoon. So yeah, Norwich or the Interstate
Yeah.
School District with Hanover,
All
New
right.
Hampshire. Yeah, it took me 7 or 8 years before I even thought that I understood the tax calculation formula, and it's taken me, and there are still things that I learn new every year that I didn't know before. It's a complex system.
Related to that, Neil, when you're training new school board members, do you feel, and I don't know if you're part of that or however the organization is. I get it, it's hard, it's complicated. Is there do you feel as though there's a thorough training there, or is it just kind of John Dewey, learn by doing sort of?
No, I mean, so when we look at the SBA, we
Yeah.
certainly provide training for school board members on this topic. And so the training is available to board members.
Yeah.
Sometimes, the challenge is to get them
Just to get them
to
there,
take
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But we try to do our best. It is a really complicated
Mhm,
topic though, and I understand if I digress slightly, like, I think Vermont's, so I get to compare to what's going on in New Hampshire because of our interstate school
Right,
district.
that's right.
Like Vermont, I think for the large part has done the right thing, right, when it
Uh-huh.
comes to education taxing. And making it equitable. The problem with that though is at the end of the day, it's really hard to explain to voters.
Whereas New Hampshire, it's.
The camera's rolling.
Okay, okay,
Let's just leave it at
okay,
that.
all right, okay,
I like the state that I live in.
okay. Fair enough, fair enough, fair enough. Thank you,
Please,
yeah,
anytime.
appreciate it.
And like I said, the other video, if you're interested in history
Yeah.
of things, that's on YouTube. I'll share it with Hayden. So
Yeah,
you
Hayden
have
can post it, yeah.
access to it. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to